The wind howled against the thin wooden walls of the cabin like a living thing, but it was the sound underneath the wind that truly made my blood turn to ice. I sat alone in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance and stretch across the floor. I had come to this remote part of the woods to find peace and quiet, yet for the last hour, I had felt a heavy, suffocating weight of being watched. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down a dirt road that was currently turning into a river of mud due to the torrential rain. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but then the heavy thud came from the porch. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch or a stray animal, but the unmistakable, deliberate weight of a boot hitting the wood. I froze in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it might crack a bone. I stared at the front door, waiting for a knock that I prayed would never come. Instead of a knock, I heard a low, metallic scraping sound near the lock. Someone was out there in the dark, and they weren't trying to be polite. I stood up slowly, making sure my feet didn't creak on the floorboards, and retreated into the kitchen where the shadows were deeper. I reached for the wall, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet, which was the only weapon I had within reach. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise because I knew he was still standing there, just inches away from me on the other side of that thin layer of wood. Suddenly, a bright beam of light cut through the darkness of the window, sweeping across the kitchen table and catching the edge of my hand. I ducked behind the counter, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps that felt like they were burning my throat. A loud, authoritative voice boomed from the porch, muffled by the thick rain but clear enough to make me pause. "State Police, is everyone all right in there? We received a call about a suspicious vehicle in the area and noticed your lights were on." I felt a momentary surge of relief, thinking that my imagination had simply run wild and that help had arrived just when I needed it most. I almost stood up to unlock the door, but something in the back of my mind screamed at me to wait. I stayed low, crawling toward the window that faced the driveway where the officer should have parked his cruiser. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see, but I could see enough to know that the driveway was completely empty. There were no blue and red flashing lights, no idling engine, and no official markings of any kind. My blood ran cold as I realized the voice was too smooth, too rehearsed, and far too calm for a man standing in a storm. I stayed silent, my eyes glued to the silhouette of the man through the frosted glass of the door. He wasn't wearing a wide-brimmed hat or a heavy uniform jacket. He was wearing a simple hooded sweatshirt pulled low over his face. "Sir, I need you to open the door so I can verify your identity for the report," the voice said again, this time with a slight edge of impatience. I didn't move an inch, hoping that if I stayed quiet enough, he would think the house was actually empty. But then he said something that made the hair on my neck stand up straight. "I know you're in the kitchen, David. I can see the reflection of your watch against the cabinet door. My name is not on the mailbox, and I hadn't told anyone except my brother where I was going." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a random encounter, and this person had been tracking me long before I arrived at this cabin. I backed away from the kitchen, moving deeper into the dark hallway that led to the bedrooms. I needed to find a way out, but the only other exit was a sliding glass door in the back that was currently jammed shut from the humidity. Every step I took felt like I was walking through deep water, my legs heavy and unresponsive from the sheer terror. I heard the man on the porch chuckle, a low and dry sound that drifted through the cracks in the door frame. "The locks on these old cabins are so simple, David. You really should have checked the windows in the back before you sat down to relax." I heard the sound of glass shattering in the rear of the house, followed by the heavy thud of someone jumping onto the hardwood floor. He was inside. The intruder was no longer pretending to be the police, and the game of cat and mouse had turned into a hunt. I ducked into the small bathroom and locked the door, knowing it wouldn't hold for long against a grown man. I climbed onto the toilet and reached for the small, narrow window above the shower. It was barely wide enough for a person to fit through, but it was my only chance of survival. As I struggled to unlatch the window, I heard his footsteps walking slowly down the hallway, heavy and rhythmic. He was whistling a low, tuneless melody that echoed off the walls, filling the small cabin with a sense of impending doom. He stopped right outside the bathroom door. I stopped moving, my hands gripping the cold metal of the window frame. "You can't stay in there forever," he whispered, his voice right against the wood of the door. "The storm is only getting worse, and nobody is coming to help you out here." I felt a surge of adrenaline as I finally forced the window open, the cold rain splashing against my face. I scrambled up, scratching my chest against the wooden frame as I squeezed my body through the tiny opening. I could hear him starting to kick at the bathroom door, the wood splintering with every strike. I pushed myself through, falling headfirst into the mud and the dead leaves outside. I didn't stop to look back. I got to my feet and ran into the blackness of the woods, the rain stinging my eyes. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, hiding in a thicket of pine trees that overlooked the cabin. From my hiding spot, I saw the man walk out onto the porch, looking frustrated and scanning the treeline with a powerful flashlight. He stood there for a long time, the beam of light passing just inches from where I was crouching in the mud. Eventually, he realized the terrain was too difficult to search in the dark, and he disappeared back toward the road. I waited in the freezing cold for hours, my body shaking uncontrollably, until the sun began to peek through the gray clouds. I walked miles to the main road and flagged down a passing truck, finally safe but knowing that the man who knew my name was still out there somewhere. The streetlights outside flickered against the heavy rain, casting long, distorted shadows across my driveway that looked like reaching fingers. I had lived in this quiet cul-de-sac for 3 years, and nothing ever happened here. That was why the sound of my garage door opening at 2 o'clock in the morning was so jarring. It started with a low, mechanical hum that vibrated through the floorboards of my bedroom. I sat up in bed, my heart skipping a beat as I listened to the heavy metal door slide upward on its tracks. I hadn't touched the remote, and I knew for a fact that I was the only person in this house. I grabbed my phone and opened the security app, but the screen just spun in a useless circle, unable to connect to the cameras. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach as I realized the Wi-Fi was completely down. I walked to the top of the stairs, my bare feet silent on the carpet, and looked toward the small window that overlooked the driveway. The garage door was wide open, revealing the empty space next to my car and the dark, cluttered interior of the storage shelves. I reached for the wall button to close it, pressing it firmly. The door groaned and began to descend, clicking shut with a finality that let me breathe a sigh of relief. I stood there for a minute, waiting, my eyes fixed on the gap at the bottom of the door. Just as I turned to go back to bed, the hum started again. The door was opening. This wasn't a mechanical failure. It felt like someone was outside, playing with the signal, forcing their way into my home 1 inch at a time. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a heavy flashlight, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Could a neighbor's remote be on the same frequency? No, that was impossible with modern rolling code technology. This was deliberate. I peered through the blinds of the kitchen window, trying to see into the darkness of the driveway. I saw a dark SUV parked at the very edge of the street, its headlights turned off and its engine silent. 2 figures were standing near the front of the vehicle, holding a small glowing device between them. They weren't looking at the house. They were looking at the device, waiting for the door to reach the top. I realized then that they were using a signal grabber to bypass my security. They weren't just burglars. They were professional enough to know exactly how to trick the system. The garage door reached its peak and stopped. I heard the sound of footsteps on the concrete, heavy and confident. They were inside the garage now. The door leading from the garage into my kitchen was the only thing standing between me and them, and I knew the lock on that door was nothing more than a simple deadbolt. I reached out and turned the lock, hearing the small click echo in the silent kitchen like a gunshot. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room for any kind of weapon. Suddenly, the power in the house cut out completely. The small green light on the microwave vanished, and the hum of the refrigerator died away, leaving me in a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against my ears. I was standing in total darkness, and I could hear them whispering on the other side of the kitchen door. One of them tried the handle, twisting it slowly back and forth. When it didn't open, there was a muffled curse, followed by a sharp metallic clinking sound. They were picking the lock. I knew I couldn't stay in the kitchen. I retreated into the living room, hiding behind the high back of the sofa, my eyes glued to the kitchen door. I watched as the handle turned all the way, and the door swung open with a soft creak. Two silhouettes entered the room, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the air like twin swords. They moved with a terrifying precision, checking the corners of the room as they advanced. "He's upstairs," one of them whispered, his voice low and gravelly. "Just get the bag and find the safe. If he comes down, we handle it." The words sent a shiver of pure electricity down my spine. They weren't just here for my electronics. They knew I had a safe, and they were prepared to handle me if I got in their way. I realized I had left my phone on the nightstand upstairs, and I was trapped on the ground floor with no way to call for help. As they started toward the stairs, I saw my chance. The door to the garage was still wide open. If I could just get past them, I could run into the street and scream for the neighbors. I waited until they reached the first landing of the staircase, their backs turned to me. I bolted from behind the sofa, my feet hitting the hardwood floor with a rhythmic slapping sound that felt incredibly loud in the silence. "Hey!" one of them shouted, his flashlight beam swinging wildly across the room and catching me in the face. I didn't look back. I dived through the kitchen and out into the garage, sprinting toward the open driveway. I could hear them crashing down the stairs behind me, their heavy boots thundering on the wood. I reached the end of the driveway and didn't stop, running toward the house across the street while screaming at the top of my lungs. Lights began to flicker on in the neighboring houses, and the dark SUV at the curb suddenly roared to life. The two men realized the neighborhood was waking up and they had lost the element of surprise. They scrambled into the vehicle, the tires screeching as they sped away into the night. I stood in the middle of the street, gasping for air and shaking, as my neighbor opened his front door with a phone in his hand. I was safe, but I knew I would never feel comfortable in that house again, knowing how easily the world outside could force its way in. The heavy, iron latch door to the basement had always been a quirk of this old Victorian house, but tonight, it felt like a barricade between me and something I couldn't quite name. I had been home alone for 3 days while my parents were away, and the silence of the massive house was starting to feel heavy and suffocating. I was sitting in the living room with the television on low volume, trying to focus on a movie, when I heard it. It was a soft, rhythmic thud coming from directly beneath my feet. It sounded like someone was hitting a rhythmic beat against the floorboards from the basement below. I turned the television off, my heart skipping a beat as I strained my ears to listen. The house was old, and I was used to the pipes groaning or the wood expanding in the cold night air. But this was different. This was deliberate. It happened again, 3 slow, steady knocks. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked toward the kitchen where the basement door was located. I reached for the light switch, but when I toggled it, nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out, or someone had unscrewed it. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and turned on the flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness of the kitchen. I approached the heavy wooden door and noticed something that made my stomach turn. The iron latch, which I specifically remembered locking before dinner, was now sitting in the open position. My breath hitched in my chest as I realized that I hadn't opened that door since the morning. I reached out to close the latch, but before my fingers could touch the metal, the door swung inward with a slow, agonizing creak. A wave of cold, damp air rushed up from the darkness of the stairs, smelling of earth and something metallic. I shone my light down the steep wooden steps, but the beam couldn't reach the bottom of the cavernous room. "Is anyone down there?" I called out, my voice cracking with a fear I couldn't hide. There was no answer, just the sound of a slow, dragging footstep echoing on the concrete floor far below. I backed away, intending to run for the front door, but a sudden shadow flickered at the edge of my vision near the pantry. Before I could react, a figure stepped out from behind the kitchen island. He was tall and dressed in dark, tattered clothing that looked like it had been covered in dust for years. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide and unblinking as they locked onto mine. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had been seized by an invisible hand. He didn't rush at me. Instead, he began to walk with a slow, predatory confidence, blocking my path to the front of the house. I realized my only escape route was the back door, but he was already moving to cut me off. In a moment of pure panic, I scrambled backward, my heels catching on the rug. I found myself pressed against the open basement door. The man lunged forward then, his hand reaching for my throat. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw my heavy flashlight at his face and threw myself backward down the basement stairs. I tumbled down the wooden steps, the world spinning in the dark until I hit the cold concrete floor with a bone-jarring thud. I scrambled into the shadows, hiding behind a row of old storage trunks and boxes. Above me, I heard the heavy basement door slam shut and the sound of the iron latch sliding into place. He had locked me in. I was trapped in the dark, and my only light source was the flashlight I had thrown, which was now lying uselessly at the top of the stairs. I sat in the pitch blackness, trying to keep my breathing silent, but my lungs were burning from the fall. That's when I heard a soft rustling sound coming from the corner of the basement, near the old coal chute. I realized with a jolt of horror that the man hadn't just entered the house tonight. There was a small mattress on the floor, surrounded by empty food wrappers and water bottles from my own kitchen. He had been living down here for days, watching me through the floorboards, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I realized how close he had been while I slept. I began to feel around the walls, my hands searching for the small, narrow window of the coal chute. If I could open it from the inside, I might be able to crawl out to the backyard. My fingers brushed against cold metal, and I felt the rusted hinges of the small door. It was stuck tight with layers of old paint and grime. Above me, the floorboards creaked as the man walked back and forth directly over my head. He was pacing, perhaps deciding what to do next. I grabbed a heavy metal crowbar from a nearby workbench and began to pry at the coal chute door with everything I had. The metal groaned, and I prayed the sound wouldn't give me away. With one final, desperate shove, the chute popped open, and a blast of cold night air hit my face. I pulled myself up into the narrow tunnel, the rough concrete scraping my arms and shoulders. I could hear the basement door upstairs being unlatched again. He was coming down to find me. I scrambled through the chute, my fingers digging into the wet dirt outside as I hauled myself out onto the grass. I didn't look back at the house. I ran toward the fence and climbed over it, sprinting toward the lights of the neighbor's house. I pounded on their door until they opened it, and I fell inside, sobbing as I told them to call the police. When the officers arrived at my house 10 minutes later, they found the basement empty, but they found the mattress and the evidence that he had been there for a long time. They never caught him that night, but I never went back into that basement again, knowing that someone had been sharing my home in the shadows for longer than I ever dared to imagine.